Well, I'm Chris Fonveille, Wilmington native and former professor emeritus in the Department of History at UNC Wilmington. Morse Creek Bridge was the first land battle of the American Revolution in North Carolina. It was extremely significant in that regard, but also because of the after effects. It led to suppression of Loyalist activity in the state, or in the colony at that time, the state in 1776. And it also led to the passage of the Halifax Resolves on April the 12th, 1776, North Carolina becoming the first to put in writing its support of the independence movement. So this was an extremely important battle in North Carolina's history, but also in our nation's history. Now, everything changed after the French and Indian War, which was part of the 7 Years' War, the global war, in the 1750s, 1760s. After the war ended in 1763, Great Britain, with a greatly expanded empire and a heavy war debt, had to raise taxes to pay down that war debt, but also to raise revenues to manage the greatly expanded empire. Colonists in America by then were used to running their own affairs, considered their colonial legislatures as miniature parliaments, and had passed laws and taxes, internal taxes. And now the British government is using much more of an iron fist to control colonial affairs. Prior to that, it was just basically navigation laws which tried to restrict colonial trade, which were evaded and not well enforced. And now the British government is saying, we're going to raise your taxes, and we're going to keep a Homeland Security Force of British regular troops there for protection, which you will have to fund and support. So the colonists saw these as burdensome and unjust taxes, their cry being taxation without representation, because they didn't have any direct representation in Parliament back in London. And again, they wanted their colonial legislatures to control those kinds of economic policies. So North Carolina, as the other colonies, started to raise protests against this new economic imperial policy. Now, North Carolina was not immune to uprisings and political protests. I mean, we'd had Culpeper's rebellion and Carey's uprising. We would see the Stamp Act resistance in 1765, which was the most egregious of the new taxes placed upon the colonists, because it affected all members of society, because all printed matter had to carry a watermark or some kind of stamp to help raise taxes. And all of the colonies resisted the Stamp Act, particularly in 1765, so much so that eventually it was repealed by Parliament in 1766. In fact, the first armed resistance to the Stamp Act in any of the colonies was right here in the Lower Cape Fear, down at Brunswicktown. Well, things got so bad by the early 1770s that the Crown was slowly losing control of the colonies and in North Carolina. The General Assemblies were dissolving, or were dissolved by the colonial governors, including Josiah Martin, the last colonial governor of North Carolina. And independent of the royal General Assemblies, provincial congresses were being established, including here in North Carolina. Much to the chagrin of Josiah Martin, the first provincial congress met in New Bern in August of 1775 to elect delegates to go to the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia that late summer and early fall. as a show of solidarity with all of the other colonies that engaged now in a non-exportation, non-importation, non-consumption policy with regard to British goods. So the provincial congresses, of course, were condemned by Josiah Martin. While he was personally amiable and an okay fella, unlike his predecessor William Tryon, who worked pretty well with the aristocracy and the leaders in colonial North Carolina, Josiah Martin did not, and got into quite a few disputes over the implementation of these new taxes, the collection of taxes, and so forth. So he came under a great deal of scrutiny, and everything in North Carolina came to a breaking point on May 23rd, 1775, when a group of Whigs, we call them patriots, but the Loyalists called themselves patriots too. So a group of American patriots or Whigs approached Tryon Palace, the governor's personal residence in New Bern, demanding why the governor had removed cannon from the yard of Tryon Palace that overlooked the river, the Neuse River. And this was a point of contention because Lord Dunmore in Virginia had denied military supplies to colonists there. And so North Carolinians saw this as sort of a similar act, a lack of support for the crown subjects. Now keep in mind that throughout 1775 and into 1776, even after the war broke out, colonists still considered themselves loyal British subjects. They had, for more than a decade, protested this change of imperial policies. They had asked for a redress of their grievances, and the pleas to the British government back in London were either ignored or simply rejected. So that continued through until 1776. So keep in mind, this was not a war for independence in the first year of fighting. This was merely a war to redress their grievances with the British Crown. So by May of 1775, Josiah Martin, again the last royal governor of North Carolina, became very concerned for his personal safety and that of his family. And so he sent his wife and children to New York for safety, but unwilling to let go of his, lost colony, for lack of a better term, he decided to stay in North Carolina and take refuge at the only serviceable British fort in the colony, which was Fort Johnston at the mouth of the Cape Fear River, about 26 miles south of Wilmington. So leaving New Bern on May 29, 1775, he traveled with his friend Archibald Nielsen by carriage out toward Cross Creek, modern Fayetteville, and then down the Cape Fear River to Fort Johnston, where he arrived about June 2nd. And from that point on, Governor Martin planned to retake control of his colony by military force if necessary. The idea being that North Carolina's interior was rife with Scottish Highlanders who had been coming to the colony since the 1730s and had pledged allegiance to the crown, to the king, to come to the colony, along with regulators who'd been dissidents in the regulator movement in the late 1760s and up to 1771. So he thought that he could raise an army of thousands of men. He grossly exaggerated when he said upwards to 30,000 combatants, if necessary, to regain control of the colony. However, he would prefer that British regular forces be sent to North Carolina to assist his efforts. So he put out his emissaries into the interior to see what kind of support he could get from the Highlanders particularly. And then he started corresponding with London about military support and with General Thomas Gage up in Boston, requesting firearms, Brown Bess muskets, musket balls, gunpowder money to launch this campaign. He went on to further assert that if he could regain control of North Carolina, then with this grand army of British regular forces and loyalists from North Carolina, he could move into South Carolina, then into Virginia, and subdue all of the southern colonies as far south as Pennsylvania. Now this was, a bold, ambitious proposal for a southern campaign in 1775, 1776. Now, Josiah Martin was not the only governor to make such proposals to the London government. Lord Dunmore in Virginia, Lord William Campbell in South Carolina made similar proposals. So why did the king expressly decide to support the campaign in North Carolina, which he did? It was largely because, Josiah Martin had really good diplomats in London, including his brother Samuel Martin and Alexander Shaw, pleading his case with the colonial secretary of state, Lord Dartmouth, who had, of course, the ear of the king, but also because the American patriots decided to deny Josiah Martin his base of operations, Fort Johnston. Initially, they planned just to occupy it, and they alerted Josiah Martin that they planned to just occupy the fort, forcing Martin to take refuge on board a British vessel of war called the Cruiser, just offshore from Fort Johnston, by July of 1775. And then on July 19th, upwards to 500 American patriots who had assembled for this operation stormed into Fort Johnston, ostensibly just to occupy it, maybe seize some muskets and any swivel guns that they could carry back up to Brunswick Town, which was their base of operations. But once they got there, they found that the muskets and the small cannons had been taken offshore to a transport vessel, and there were slaves inside Fort Johnston, lending credence to the rumors that Josiah Martin, as well as other southern governors, had planned to so-called incite slave rebellion. And nothing struck fear in the heart of white Southerners than slave insurrection. So then they decided, rather than just occupy the fort, we're going to destroy the fort. And they did. They burned it. On July 19th, 1775, Fort Johnston, the property of King George III was burned to the ground. Now this was not just an act of defiance, this was in effect, according to the Crown, an act of rebellion. This was destruction of the king's property. Now, as far as North Carolinians were concerned, it was their property because it had been erected with their tax money. But the fort, the cannons, the supplies really were the property of King George. And so that's the other reason that the Crown supported the launching of a Southern campaign in North Carolina in retaliation for the Patriots' destruction of the king's property at Fort Johnston. So keep those things in mind. After the destruction of the fort, Josiah Martin issued the so-called fiery declaration, the fiery declaration, in August of 1775, which condemned what the colonists had done, and then said that lawful government now had ended, and he was going to use much tougher measures to try and regain control of North Carolina. And so that's when the operation that would lead to Moore's Creek began in earnest. And even the king finally approved. Now, Governor Martin requested 2 battalions of British regulars and maybe a couple of pieces of field artillery he thought were enough to subdue North Carolina in aid with the Loyalists in the interior. But instead the king decided, I'm going to send 5 regiments of troops. In other words, more than 4,000 British regular forces and 2 batteries of artillery and 10 pieces of light field artillery for this southern campaign. So this was much more than Martin anticipated or even expected. The idea was that troops from Ireland, to be led by the Marquis Charles Cornwallis, would leave and rendezvous at the Cape Fear with troops that would be coming out of the Boston area, to be led by General Henry Clinton. The anticipated rendezvous date would be mid-February of 1776. Think of communication and transportation at the time. It took weeks for correspondence to get across the big pond, and then weeks for the colonial government in London to respond to the correspondence coming out of North America. So the rendezvous would be mid-February. In early January, Josiah Martin put out a call for Loyalists in the interior of North Carolina to assemble, to organize, and then march down the Cape Fear River to Brunswicktown, where they would meet the incoming British regular forces from Ireland and from New England. The American patriots, of course, didn't sit idly by. Emboldened by their destruction of Fort Johnston, they began recruiting additional combatants for a defensive war. But now they learned that Josiah Martin had planned an invasion using Loyalist and British regular forces of North Carolina, and so they responded by organizing their own forces. The first provincial line, North Carolina line, later would be the North Carolina Continental Line, along with local Minutemen and militia, not just from the New Hanover County precinct, but also from the Craven County precinct, from all over southeastern North Carolina, started to organize and plan to intercept the march of the Loyalists from the Cross Creek area down the Cape Fear River. They intercepted Governor Martin's playbook because Martin made the mistake of putting in writing this proclamation of organizing the Loyalists and offered them a hefty bounty if they would join his army. That is, they would each receive a musket with accoutrements. They would receive a hefty land bounty. They would receive arrears from quit-writ payments for up to 20 years. They would receive a bounty for enlisting. So these were very enticing offers by the governor. Problem was that he put it in writing. And of course the Patriots intercepted the proclamation and then started to organize their own forces and to respond. The Loyalist forces did organize at Cross Creek in mid-February. Martin did not get the upwards to 30,000 men that he anticipated. There were somewhere around 1,600 men led by Major Donald MacDonald in the British Army, but he was also General Donald MacDonald in Governor Martin's provincial army. He actually had 2 commissions. And led by Donald MacDonald, they began their march in early February, mid-February, which was the time that they were supposed to rendezvous with the incoming British forces. But the British forces had sort of gotten strung out and delayed by weather and logistics, and did not even arrive beginning until March, and straggled into the Cape Fear River until May of 1776. By then, of course, it was too late. Everything changed when Loyalist forces were intercepted by American Patriot forces at the Battle of Morris Creek Bridge on February 27, 1776.
Sounded great.
What was that, about 10